So we last left off with the so-called triumvirate of Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar coming together, forming this alliance to try and more or less prevent a dictatorship. Now we can get an idea of how things break down. All right, once he was no longer consul, Caesar, with the persuasion of Pompey's armed guards, got elected as governor of Gaul, and you can think of Gaul as France. He built a camp just north of the Rubicon River to keep an eye on Rome. Now, the Rubicon River is the border of Caesar's province. 5 years later, the three men met again, and they gave Caesar another 5 years to cement his power in Gaul. And you can see that, when Caesar was in Gaul, this is when he invaded Britain. And although he doesn't exactly conquer the British Isles, he does become very wealthy. Meanwhile, Crassus and Pompey would become consuls to make this happen. And then Crassus would go off to fight in the east to gain his military glory, while Pompey became governor of Hispania, turn a profit. The Senate was suspicious of Crassus and Pompey, but the people were on Caesar's side. Now Crassus goes off and gets himself killed in battle near the Euphrates River, so we're left with Caesar and Pompey. Now Caesar had just put down a successful rebellion in Gaul, so he was to return to Rome richer than Pompey and with more glory. This made Pompey nervous, because with Crassus gone, nobody could oppose Caesar. Not a single person. Pompey and the Senate ordered Caesar to return home without his army, but Caesar knew that if he was unprotected, he'd probably be killed. He reached the border of his province, the Rubicon River. He paused and stated, Alia icta est, which means, let the die be cast. And this means that when he crosses the river, he'll be viewed as an invader. And to this day, whenever someone makes a choice or a decision that's no turning back from, they say that they have crossed the Rubicon. That phrase is still with us. Now, Pompey fled the initial engagement, and Caesar pursued him to Egypt, which was where he was last seen heading. Caesar was going towards Alexandria, and the leader of Alexandria, Ptolemy XIII, he actually descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, so they're still in power. He had Pompey murdered. It's also there where Caesar met Cleopatra. He turned back to Roman territory and destroyed the armies of Pompey's sons. He made a triumphant return to Rome in 46 BC, a conquering hero. Now, when he did return to Rome, he was given a victory parade that was led by a sign that said, Veni Vidi Vici, which means I came, I saw, I conquered. He was allowed to wear a purple robe with gold trim, and he had statues of himself placed all around the city. He enjoyed the support of the army and provided citizenship to all who fought with him in the Gallic Wars. He personally appointed magistrates. He passed laws. He increased the number of senators to 900 to dilute their powers, and he pretty much became the Senate, tribunes, assembly, and council all rolled into one. Now, he altered the calendar. He altered the calendar so that it would follow the sun. The Julian calendar was introduced and gave us the 4-year leap year system that we have today. Oddly enough, to make this adjustment, the year 46 BC was 445 days long, so that's quite the long year. His right-hand man, Mark Antony, tried placing a crown on his head after the Senate named him dictator for life. They named him dictator for life, but he read the mood and refused it, led to thunderous applause. However, the Senate decided that he would wear a crown only when out of the city on campaign, and this made some senators very nervous, including his cousin Marcus Brutus, who was actually named in Caesar's will. On the Ides of March, the middle of the month, Mark Antony was stalled at the Senate door while Caesar's enemies surrounded him and stabbed him to death. They surrounded him and stabbed him to death, and Antony broke through to save Caesar's body, so it could not be thrown into the Tiber River. The conspirators marched out and declared that the Romans could resume their liberty. They're boasting about it. Now, Mark Antony retrieved the body, and he made sure that the will was read out loud. It included a provision that Caesar's massive fortune would be divided among the citizens of Rome. His body was carried throughout Rome, and a riot began once the people saw the mutilation of a man that they had loved so much. So the dictator for life did not last very long. Now, what we might refer to as the Republic hung on for about another 15 years. It hasn't been a republic for a while, but we can still pretend it was. Mark Antony gave Caesar's funeral speech, and he was assisted by an armed guard that was led by Lepidus. And Lepidus was a man that Caesar had appointed as governor of Gaul and Spain. He had been gathering troops before he left, so now they guarded and protected Mark Antony. Mark Antony and Lepidus formed an alliance, with Antony in control and Lepidus as the high priest of Rome, a position known as Pontifex Maximus. Meanwhile, Caesar's adopted son Octavian is now 18, and he immediately went back to Rome once he heard about his uncle's murder. Octavian and Antony deeply distrusted each other, and Octavian made sure to build alliances with Antony's enemies, and also with the orator Cicero. Cicero doesn't trust Octavian, part of this new triumvirate, but he believes he's the best counter to Mark Antony. Cicero is one of the best speakers of all time, and he convinced the Senate to declare Mark Antony an enemy of state. Now, Octavian just wants power. All right, he doesn't want a war. So he proposed a new triumvirate of himself, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. They wrote up an agreement, and this agreement also included a list of individuals that they each wanted eliminated. So yeah, there's some pretty shady stuff going on here. Now eventually the desire for power gets the best of him. Lepidus landed on Sicily to gain it for himself, but Octavian placed him under house arrest for the rest of his life, and there wasn't much he could do about it. By the year 34 BC, Octavian declared Antony an enemy of Rome and declared war on him. He illegally read Mark Antony's will out loud in the Senate, where it was discovered that Mark Antony not only wanted to be buried in Egypt, but he left most of his money to the twin children that Cleopatra bore him. So there was an affair going on there. The forces of Octavian and Antony clashed near northern Greece at the Battle of Actium. But 60% of Antony's ships are destroyed, and most of his men defected to Octavian's side. Octavian's going to pursue Antony back to Egypt, but Antony stabbed himself with a sword, and Cleopatra also committed suicide. To solidify the power, Cleopatra's son, via Julius Caesar, was also put to death. In 29 BC, Octavian returns to Rome, and frankly, the populace is sick of war. Octavian had a victory parade. He gave money to all Roman citizens, and 2 years later, he quote-unquote gave Rome back to the Senate. This was all for show, because in return he was given control of Rome's provinces, which meant that he controlled the army, and he was allowed to form a bodyguard for himself, known as the Praetorian Guard. So he not only controls the legions, he has his own private army. He also assumed the title of Augustus, which, depending on how you translate it, it's either revered one or first citizen. This will officially lead to the empire. The empire has officially begun. Now, all this time, Lepidus was still alive under house arrest. Well, he died in the year 13 BC. So Augustus assumed that religious role of high priest, Pontifex Maximus. This meant that one man is in charge of the highest political and religious offices within Rome. It's no longer spread out. Under his leadership, the borders of Rome stretched to the Rhine and Danube rivers in the northeast, to all of Iberia to the west, and Syria to the east, as well as North Africa. The army becomes all volunteer. All right, we're talking an all volunteer force with 25-year enlistments, and you can see the number here. 350,000 troops to secure the frontier. That's 6% of the population. They began building roads to connect the empire, which we'll see when we look at Roman culture, but the army ensured the safety of all travel. So this ushered in what's called the Roman peace, or the Pax Romana. And you can see the breakdown here of Roman territory just before Caesar, what Caesar conquered, and then under Augustus, all of the Iberian Peninsula up to the Rhine and the Danube, and Egypt is added under his reign. Now, for the rest of his life, Augustus not only diminished the powers of the senators, but he grappled with the issue of appointing an heir. He had no son of his own, so a stopgap was introduced where he married his daughter off to his stepson, Tiberius. Yes, married his daughter off to his stepson. Just go with it. Tiberius was cold and distant, and he didn't really want power, but Augustus ran out of options and adopted him 10 years before he died. Now, officially, there was no such thing as hereditary rule, but he gave Tiberius more and more power over the army, and the Senate confirmed his power. Power passed to Tiberius after the death of Augustus. And the heirs of Caesar, there's this tradition of emperors adopting individuals to serve. The Julio-Claudians, the heirs of Caesar, are going to reign until the suicide of Nero in the year 68. So 95 years from the start of the reign of Augustus. Now this begins with Augustus, but it spills over to the emperors Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. So from here on out, whenever we speak of Rome, we are speaking of the Roman Empire.